History Month virtual lecture series. My name is Meredith Patterson, and I'm here to introduce our speaker of the day, who's Janie Cooper-Wilson. So Janie Cooper-Wilson has had a lifelong passion for history and has dedicated her adult life to researching and documenting the history of Black Ontarians. She is a strong advocate for the preservation of Ontario's endangered historical buildings and early cemeteries. Janie is the founder and executive director of the SilverShoe Historical Society and a director of the Ontario Historical Society. Her roles at the OHS include field representative for Simcoe and Grey counties and co-chair of the Cemetery Preservation and Defense Committee. Over her long career, Janie has authored numerous articles and publications. She was the driving force behind the restoration and heritage designation of the Bethel Union and Old Zion Presbyterian Church in Clearview, or Cemeteries, in Clearview, and was the face of the intense public relations initiative to preserve the Oro African Methodist Episcopal Church National Historic Site. Her many awards include the Ontario Historical Society's Carnochan Award in 2012, the Orillia Museum of Art and History Historic Reconstruction Award in 2015, and the Ontario Black History Society Harriet Tubman Award in 2018, and is one of Canada's 100 Accomplished Black Women for 2018. Presently, Janie continues her efforts to assist families and attempting to relocate she assists families attempting to relocate their hereditary links to long-lost ancestors and is attempting to save several crucial Black history sites in Haldimand County from obliteration. So as you can see, she's a very prestigious speaker, and she definitely has a large knowledge base. So I'm going to pass it over to Janie, and she's going to share her topic of Lemuel Brown. Thank you, Janie.
Thank you, Meredith. And I'd like to thank the Simcoe County Museum for inviting me to speak today and for their interest in Black history and Black History Month. I'd also like to do a little shout out to two of my very dear friends and colleagues, Peter Myler and Hilary Dawson. This work that is ongoing concerning the presentation today, and without them, it would not have happened. My presentation is not only from the standpoint of a historian, it's from the standpoint of a descendant that knew absolutely nothing from before 1851. The presentation is about reclaiming the life of Lemuel Brown, colonial slave, circa 1801 to circa 1871. He was a man and my long-lost paternal, 2 times great-grandfather. He is also a former first-generation Black resident of Grey and Simcoe counties. And he is a man upon whose shoulders I stand. So in his memory and in honor of Black History Month, I say his name, Lemuel Brown. We knew very little about Lemuel, except that his family was listed in 1851 and 1861 in Artemisia Township. He owned 100 acres of land at Lot 18, Old Durham Road in Artemisia Township. Before that time, we knew absolutely nothing about him. And previously, I mentioned my deep gratitude to my friend and colleague, Peter Myler. This is a photo of Peter and I standing on Lemuel's property at Lot 18, Old Durham Road. Right next door was his brother-in-law and sister-in-law, Philemon Workman and Clarissa Johnson and their family. Now that branch of the family returned to the United States, and a few years ago I had an opportunity to meet and have coffee with some of their descendants in Cincinnati, Ohio. The last record we had of Lemuel was the 1871 census in Collingwood. You'll see his name. He's listed as 70 years of age. He was from the US. He was Episcopal Methodist. And I was curious and kind of confused about why they scratched out Negro and put African. And he was a laborer. His wife, Phoebe Workman, is shown as 52 years of age. His daughter, Susan or Susanna, 20. William, age 17, and Joshua, age 13. And also Alexander Green, age 2. That's Alexander as a grown man in the inset. That is Susan's daughter or son, Lemuel and Phoebe's grandson. My grandmother was already married and living in Collingwood at that time with a household of boys and a few girls. One of them, my grandfather, Frederick James Cooper in Collingwood. This is a very poor photo of Lemuel Alexander Cooper, circa 1872 to 1943. This was the only other link that we had to Lemuel Brown, was the fact that Uncle Alec was named for him. Alec was the eldest of Hannah Brown and Joseph Cooper's children. And then, of course, we hit a brick wall because there was no one alive that knew Lemuel. Until 1999, when I met Peter Myler at the Collingwood Library, when he was doing his book signing for A Stolen Life, Searching for Richard Pierpont, which he wrote with his brother David. And I was introduced to Peter by the late, great Les McKinnon. Now, I was just a new kid on the block with all this research, and I was working on the site down in New Lowell, restoring the cemetery there, and they asked me to do a Black History display. So there was a lull, and Peter came up to me. He's a very gracious, soft-spoken gentleman, and he turned to the center page of his book, and he just pointed at it. And I began to cry because there in Richard Pierpont's will, next slide, you can see that his beneficiary and sole heir was none other than Lemuel Brown. That will was dated 28th of January, 1828. Now the next slide will show you the land that was referred to in that will. The first piece of land with the pointing by the upward arrow is in Grantham Township. That land was Pierpont's land from his military service in the American Revolution. The other piece of land in Garifraxa Township was what he received for his service in the War of 1812. He really didn't want that piece of land. He wanted to be sent back to Africa to die because he was my age at that point. Next slide. This is a photo of Fergus in Garifraxa Township, circa 1838. This is what it would have looked like when Richard Pierpont died, and it would have been, this scene would have been very familiar to my 2 times great-grandfather. I had been to Fergus many, many times, but this past summer I was invited to speak at the Pierpont Park, working with 2 groups of wonderful individuals, and it was the first time that I was able to set foot on my ancestors' land and Richard Pierpont's land. It was very moving. Now, obviously there was no television, and it's been reported that Lemuel had 17 children. Now, this number was determined by his daughter Susanna's obituary, where she claimed that she was one of 17 children. Now, I found, and with the help of Peter, 11, and those 11 are shown here. Hannah, who died in 1915, that is my great-grandmother. Susanna, she started the Libertas Medicine Company in Woodstock. It was world renowned. She married Reverend Libertas, who was preaching at the British Methodist Episcopal Church in Collingwood when they met. Next. Now, there's 17 children, so there was 11 there, but how many were Phoebe's? We didn't know. This shows Phoebe's death registration, and it states she was born in Ohio circa 1807, and she died in Collingwood the 12th of August, 1896. Now, the synchronicity was amazing with this journey, because as a little girl, I used to play in the ruins of Phoebe's home, which was on the back part of my dad's present-day property. Then, of course, Peter found this little gem. We knew absolutely nothing about Rosanna Brown. We don't know where she went, what their issues were. We don't know if she remarried, if she was re-enslaved. We have no idea, but obviously Lemuel wasn't too happy about it, and she must have run up a number of debts. Now that is 1830. What we did know was in 1839, he lived in Guelph Township, Wellington County, and he sold, the same year, he sold Pierpoint's land in Fergus for 53 pounds. By 1841, he was living in St. Catharines, and from what I understand, this was actually in Pierpoint's house in St. Catharines in the Niagara district. And in 1849, he took the oath of allegiance to the British Crown, and at that time he was living in Wellesley Township, east of Waterloo, in the Queen's Bush. So it was always said, next slide please. It was always said that if you honor the ancestors, they will honor you and bless you. Well, in 2016, I received a wonderful blessing. I was working on the oral church. I was dead tired. I came home and received an email from Peter Myler. Dear Hillary had found an excerpt from the Canadian magazine published in 1907. And lo and behold, next slide, it was the narrative of none other than Lemuel Brown. It was recorded by Mr. William Harrison, who met Grandpa Lemuel on the stagecoach coming from Osprey Township. Now, judging, there was no date given when this interview was done, but my guess is that he was coming into Collingwood to see his first great-grandson, his first grandson, Lemuel. Now, William Harrison, in the narrative, described Grandfather Lemuel as a well-dressed, intellectual-looking, tall, white-haired colored man of pleasing manners, who entertained his fellow passengers with his sage and oftentimes witty remarks. As I read on, as I said, I was tired, and I'm reading and reading and reading, and I thought, this Mr. Harrison is talking about my father, because it described him perfectly. Then I realized that this couldn't possibly be the case because my dad wasn't born until 1911. I stayed up all night. I was just, I couldn't get my eyes off what I was reading. What I learned was that through his narrative, and he was very explicit, he indicated that he was enslaved to the Page family of Vermont. And although he didn't give a name of his master, I found in my investigations, there were 49 out of 50 branches of the Page family in Vermont that seemed to fit where his owners were. And out of those, there were 6 female heads of household. They were distributed through the state in 9 counties and 33 towns. Now, that's like finding a needle in the haystack. So that's why I say it's ongoing research. I believe that in my own heart, I believe that his master was Reverend William Page. Now, he looked at Page as a surrogate father. He's just a little child, and we knew nothing about his mother or his father. And the state of Vermont had a very ambiguous constitution, you know, and how they approached slavery. Now, they have gone down in history as the first in the states to abolish slavery. But their 1777 Constitution remained very, very vague. And it wasn't until 1791 that they did an update on that, similar to our own Canadian system here, where people are still confused about John Graves Simcoe's edict of 1793. It was more or less a gradual emancipation. So the difference with Lemuel, even though they were enslaved, they could testify against a white man. So, as I said, Lemuel looked at Mr. Page as a surrogate father. And Page had a friend named George Gould. He owned the Gould Hotel in New York State. I'm still trying to find the exact location of that, but there had to be a close proximity because Lemuel describes Gould as Mr. Page's neighbor. So it could have been just across the line. Gould would come and visit, and he coerced the child with candies and oranges. Now, a little child, they don't understand that sometimes, you know, that's just a ploy. Well, Lemuel soon found out because he was asked to go to visit George Gould at his home to play with his children, but Gould's children wouldn't let him in the house because he was too black. And then he talked Page into allowing him to take Lemuel for a visit. And one day, Lemuel discovered that George Gould was his second owner. Next, please. Once Gould purchased Lemuel, he changed. He was no longer the nice gentleman that gave him candies and oranges. He was the master, and he was very hard on Lemuel, and so was his children. And then one day, Lemuel went into the pantry and there was a little ray of light coming through the wall, and he peeked through and he discovered a secret room. Sitting in the secret room was a man that he recognized as Lyman Hawley. Next slide. Next slide. Lyman was Gould's adopted son. He was about 19 years old, and he was involved in smuggling, which was rampant in the area at that time. And he was also charged with murder. He had been in jail in Rutland for the murder of a man named John Luce, who was a toll gate keeper, and in Hubbardton. He was arrested October 7th, 1812, which helps to give us a timeline for Lemuel. And he escaped the 19th of November, 1812. His trial had been set for February of 1813. So he hot-footed to Gould's hotel. Lemuel was obviously, and I think that gene comes down the old tube, he was a little cocky, and he would not take a beating from Gould. One of Gould's children had slapped him. He'd kept quiet. And then he was accused of stealing preserves. Well, like, doesn't fall far from the tree. And if any one of my family is accused of something and it's not true, we stand our ground, as did Lemuel. Lemuel also knew Vermont law, that he could testify. He wanted to, I believe, use this information as leverage for better treatment. And also about the same time, a relative of Gould's had passed away, and Lemuel was in charge of caring for the man on his deathbed. As a result, the gentleman left Lemuel a bay horse, which matched his master's horse. Unfortunately, slaves were not allowed to own property, so Gould claimed the horses. Now, I found a Henry Gould, age 23, which I'm assuming was one of George Gould's children, who died February 5th, 1813. So the timeline fits. His will was probated on March 3rd, 1813. Then, all was quiet, and Gould announced to Lemuel that he was going to be going on a trip. Next slide. Next slide, please. He was taking the horses, this was the story, to Lake Champlain to be sold. Now, I'm assuming that because, the country was at war, that these horses were going to be sold to military. When he got there to Lake Champlain, he was taken aboard a ship, and he was introduced to another of Gould's sons and the ship's master. And he was asked if he would like to take a tour of this sloop. Well, of course, he said yes. He'd probably never been on board a ship, and like any child, he would be absolutely thrilled with the things he would see. Before he knew it, the ship was under sail, and it was moving towards Plattsburgh, New York. Next slide, please. Here you can see Rutland, where Lyman Hawley was incarcerated. And you can see the other arrow points to Plattsburgh, New York. When he arrived there, he realized, next slide, please. He was sold again. And this time he was taken to the encampment of the American Army, where he was sold to this Army officer. Next slide. Colonel Daniel Bethel, 1768 to 1833. He was a career soldier. He was also a large slaveholder who was born in Louisiana, although he had plantations in Kentucky and Missouri. He was a harsh and cruel master. And again, this is hard for me to wrap my head around it, because in all my work, you know, I read about other narratives and they talk about whipping their slaves. But it was coming home to roost. This was my own blood. And if I say to you, my skin tingled, it was as though I could feel the treatment that my ancestor received at this man. Now, one thing Lemuel did say was that he didn't feel that Bethel, you know, really zeroed in on him. He just would not tolerate any kind of questioning of his authority. And it was the way things were at that time. But being such a large slaveholder, I must wonder whether it was just he did not see Lemuel as a man. He just saw him as a slave. First thing they knew, Daniel Bethel received marching orders, and they were to go on a forced march to none other than the Niagara frontier. Next slide. This was in the spring of 1813. It was getting a little hot around, you know, Queenston Heights, that area, and the burning of Newark, all of those things. And that was, Lemuel was with them when that happened. So I imagine he received a few good whoopings on the way, learning a different way of life, you know, going from a minister's home to a hotel keeper's home to being a personal servant to a military officer of Bethel's caliber. When they reached the Niagara frontier, of course, they faced the wrath of the British regulars, the Canadian militia, the Colored Corps, and Brant's Indigenous warriors. Next slide. Okay. Now, whether he met my maternal 2 times great-grandfather, I don't know. But I do know that Private Samuel Thomas of Oro was at Queenston Heights. Now, I automatically assumed that because our family had always been loyal to the British Crown, that I really don't know what I was thinking. I just automatically assumed, which I would not encourage anyone else to do. I always say, look at all the possibilities, but I never once thought that Lemuel, I might find him with the American Army. I just couldn't, it just couldn't register in my head. So I thought, well, I've got to find a way to justify all this in my own mind. So I searched and I searched and I searched, and I found a list of private servants to General Bethel. Next slide. And there he was. In July of 1814, so he'd been in service to Bethel for a year, at least a year then some. And he mentioned you know, that there were other servants, but I did not know about these two, his P. Ellison and a Charles Truly. The next slide, please. Well, as most soldiers, you know, when they're not on the battlefield and they're just camping out without receiving their orders yet, and they're wasting a little bit of time, they love to play cards. Well, General Bethel wasn't the exception. He loved to play cards. So he entered into a card game and he lost my ancestor, Lemuel, in a wager in a card game. The new owner was John G. Camp, the quartermaster for the American Army at the time. Next slide. Now, Camp was a vicious and sadistic master. But curiously, he became the first sheriff of Erie County. And amazingly, I have relatives in Buffalo and spent many, many happy times in Buffalo with family and friends. Next slide. The synchronicity was unbelievable. We also know that he was wounded at the Battle of Lundy's Lane on July 25th, 1814. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the war, and he was in the thick of it. And how he was wounded, next slide, please. He was sent to receive General George McClure's bridle and saddle from the battlefield. McClure's horse had been hit with a cannonball, and of course, I imagine the saddle was quite expensive. And in the process, Lemuel was shot with a mini ball in the leg. He escaped from the battlefield, but he fainted in the process and had to recover. Now, he was on duty, next slide, please, during these battles. Capture of Fort Erie in July 3rd, July 5th, he was at the Battle of Chippewa. Again, the 25th, he was wounded at the Battle of Lundy's Lane, and he was forced to march to the siege of Fort Erie and was there for August 4th to the 21st of September, 1814. Next slide, please. Now, he would have known this gentleman, Brigadier General Jacob Jennings Brown, 1775 to 1828. Curiously, Brown was a Quaker, and during the American Revolution, many Quakers were put in the position of having to make the decision to carry arms or to fight for their country. Brown was a Congressional Medal of Honor, but it seems that Lemuel, I wonder if he had, and he obviously would have known Jacob Jennings Brown for quite some time, and I'm wondering if he took his surname. We have no proof of it, but that's just the feeling I have. He seems to me that he, through his narrative, he had great respect for General Brown. Next, please. Now, another document I found was the payroll list of private servants to the officers of the General Staff, again in July of 1814, and these men were under the command of George Izard. Now, I'd like to know more about these people. What happened to them? Where did they go? What happened to their owners? And Tom Van Rensselaer seems to really twig. I have a funny feeling that we'll find a connection there as well. Next slide. Now, Lemuel was still recovering, or had just recovered from his wound at the Battle of Lundy's Lane, when his new master, Camp took offense to some misdemeanor, and Lemuel was not going to take a beating for it, and he ran. And Camp tied him up to a tree so that his feet barely touched the ground, and he whipped him till the blood ran into his boots. And he describes this in detail. He said he lost all feeling in his back, and then Camp forced him to ride for 2 weeks when they were moving towards the siege of Fort Erie. Now, this photograph I had seen many, many times in the past. And all through my life, I've always been aware of my slave ancestry and been proud of it. But at no time did any of my ancestors talk about any whippings that they received. And when I saw this photo and realized that this is exactly how my ancestor would have been whipped, I cried. And I still feel sick in my stomach when I think about what he endured. Next slide, please. Both armies went into winter quarters following the siege of Fort Erie. And the winter quarters for the American Army at the time was in Buffalo. And John Camp's office was in his house. So as quartermaster, all the supplies for the American Army would be held in John Camp's house. Next slide, please. Now, this is a picture of Buffalo, and from the looks of this, it appears it's very near Niagara Falls Boulevard. Now, Ananti lives on Niagara Falls Boulevard, and as many times as I was there, I was not aware that my own ancestor was present there during the War of 1812. Now, in the background, pay close attention to the ships in the background. That would be where the Navy Yard is, the old Navy Yard. Now, Lemuel's duty for camp would be to take messages to and from the ships, and if they wanted supplies or ordnances, they would give Lemuel the message and he would transport it. So Lemuel was well aware of how to get around that area. So when he was in Camp's house and the quartermaster's office, there were 2 other slaves there. An older slave named Sam, who to me seemed to be very resigned to his station as a slave. It was probably just, any will to try for freedom just was beaten right out of him. The other was a teenage boy named Bob, who was about Lemuel's age. And Bob was a habitual runner. And Lemuel talked about how he had to treat the wounds on Bob's back and pull the cloth from his shirt out of the wounds and dress it and grease him so that his clothing wouldn't stick to, the sores. Next slide, please. Now, Camp was known for having parties. And one particular incident happened. I call it the pancake incident. Camp invited officers, including Jennings Brown and, some of the other officers at that time. I have no idea how many. And Lemuel was ordered to make pancakes. Now, if you recall the war, our capital of York was burned. And in retaliation, the British burned Black Rock and they burned Buffalo. So there were only about 4 houses left in Buffalo at this time, and Camp's house was one of them. So obviously there was very little wood. And the first batch of pancakes were very well received, and Camp ordered Lemuel to make more. Unfortunately, poor Lemmy ran out of wood. He went to find more, and Camp took offense. He blamed Lemuel for breaking up his party, threatened to beat him again. Next slide. While working in the quartermaster's office, Lemuel was familiar with everything in there, including 2 lovely little pistols that he secretly loaded and hid. And he told Sam that he was never going to take another beating from Camp. In the meanwhile, Bob decided to run again, and it was reported that Bob drowned. I think Bob was caught and was purposely drowned, let's put it that way. And Camp used that as a threat against Lemuel not to try anything like that. And the soldiers, I can't imagine like living in the American Army camps on Canadian soil and not realize that they were on free soil. So what they told them was that if the Canadians caught them, they would be scalped and killed immediately. That's what they were told. Or to sit, or stand outside the door of their house or their officer's tent and look across the river and see freedom and not be able to touch it. It was terrible. Anyway, Camp decided he wanted to give Lemuel another beating. And when he ripped the shirt off, the wounds from the previous beating had not healed yet. His officers, the fellow officers, were appalled, and many of them left. Now, McClure, he went to bat for Lemuel, and I'm assuming that Jacob Jennings Brown did as well. But they were appalled with Camp's behavior. Next slide, please. Well, as it turned out, Camp had his back turned one day, and he had threatened Lemuel. Lemuel retrieved the pistols and took aim. Sam backhanded Lemmy and knocked him to the ground. The pistol went off, scared the master, who turned around, and Sam lied and said that Lemuel tripped. But that would have been immediate execution. Immediate execution. I doubt he would have even been given the dignity to be shot. He would probably be hung. Now, in the process of that, this is something I found very curious. Lemmy lost a front tooth. My father also lost a front tooth because of a .22 rifle, and the bolt backfired and hit him in the face, and he lost a front tooth as well. He was forced to wear glasses for some time. Anyway, the die was cast. Next slide, please. Lemuel had no choice. It was escape or he would eventually die one way or another. So he went back to the Navy Yard in the middle of the night. He said he left about 11 o'clock at night. He sneaked out, made his way to the Navy Yard, found a dugout boat, and paddled his way across to the Canadian soil. Next slide, please. Now, he said he saw a man on horseback. He did not identify the man, but I must wonder, was it Richard Pierpont that he saw? Who was this man on horseback? Clearly, he was near St. Catharines. He was taken there. The man took him into his home, fed him, clothed him, sheltered him, helped him find work. And then eventually, as we know, Lemuel ended up being Pierpont's beneficiary. I do hope that you've enjoyed the presentation. I am sorry about the techno glitches. I feel a little bit better because I came into the museum to do this today because I was having technical problems at home. So these things happen. I do hope that you enjoyed the presentation. And are there any questions at all?
Yes, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand and then you can unmute yourself, or you can type it in the meeting chat if there's any questions. It seems, oh, there we go. Karen Upshaw said, "What an interesting life. Thank you so much for presenting today. Was it common for a person to be sold so many times?"
Sometimes more. Sometimes more. It really depended on the needs of and the whim of the masters. Many times it was because of a master died and the family wanted to settle the estate, or he had debts. They could be sold for any number of reasons. If you think of a piece of livestock, an animal, that's the way we were treated. It's the way our people were treated. They weren't considered human.
And then, so we have a question from Taylor Ross. So Taylor, do you want to unmute yourself and then you can ask the question?
Just curious to know about the scalping. Would that be on the Canadian side or the US side? And why would they assume that they would be scalped?
So she's curious. Oh, did you hear?
Yeah, so Taylor was wondering about the scalping. Remember, you made reference that they were afraid that they'd be scalped on the Canadian side. She was just wondering where that might have originated from. That's correct, right, Taylor?
Well, I think it was just, keep in mind the soldiers in the American Revolution, they were trained in scalping. Remember, the indigenous brothers and sisters, they counted coup. They took scalps. And even Richard Pierpont, he would have been trained in scalping techniques as well. It was a fear tactic. If someone told you, don't go over that river, you're going to get scalped, and you envision a knife, you being grabbed by your top knot and your scalp taken partly off and then ripped the rest of the way, would you be a little scared? That's just the way it was back then. And I'm sure that carried over into the War of 1812 as well.
We have a couple comments. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Janie.
I missed that comment there. There was something about Pierpont.
Yeah, so I have a comment from Cheryl. It's a great presentation, although heartbreaking to hear. So thank you so much. And then Karen Upshaw has a question. She said, were you able to check if Pierpont left any records mentioning having rescued someone who was escaping to Canada, or maybe provided a description or a name?
Peter Myler is the foremost authority on Richard Pierpont. And that's why it came as such a shock when we found his will. And the Pierpont settlement at Fergus was transient. Like, you can find people that went through there, and the same with Oro, that came into all the settlements in Canada. I don't know that Pierpont did. Maybe he did. I haven't heard of it though.
Taylor, did you have another question?
I would be really, at the Indians themselves, Canadian Indians on the Canadian side, would welcome the Black people without any hassle, because their skin colors was close to the native Indians as well. even though they weren't born there. Some of them were born there, and that should have been accepted.
Well, that's true, but remember, it was a slaveholder that was telling them that.
True.
It was
Yeah.
all fabricated. It was all fabricated.
Yeah.
You know, they would say anything because they obviously felt that Black people didn't have any intelligence to start with. This was a strange country. And Lemuel wasn't very old at this time. He was still a teenager.
So there was a lot of lies all the way around.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. That's
And
really
you see,
sad,
that's
really.
why, as I was saying to Meredith before, you know, we went on the air there. This is part of my journey now, because I'm of an age where it's time. I'm mentoring more than I am actually out there working now. And what is important is that the history, the Black history, must be presented from the Black perspective for people to understand what it was like for us. Not the propaganda, but we could think for ourselves. We had feeling. Like how people say, what I was told when I was working on the Oro Church, oh, your people just walked away. They didn't care. And I, you know, they didn't care about the children. They didn't care about their dead. Of course we did. Of course we did. And we still do. But it's very, very important that our history is told factually. If we're unsure, check it out. Don't just put it out there, because the next round, we won't have any history left. So it's crucial.
So Karen has made another, she had said, lies we told to make ourselves feel better about what we were doing.
From whose standpoint?
I'm assuming from like the European standpoint. Is that correct, Karen?
Yeah, for sure. I think it was a way of hiding, because there were people who would have stepped in. But if you could convince them that Black people weren't intelligent, didn't care about their children, didn't care about church or family, then you could probably get away with a lot more. And it would make yourself feel better, because you could convince yourself that people really weren't the same, weren't equal.
Well, taking that feel-good victory lap was one thing, but they had to, it was a religious-based society. And it was even preached in the pulpits for the slaves to honor their master, do what their master said. The masters held the life and death over us. And that's what it's hard for people to understand. We had no rights any more than if you have a dog and you say, I want more puppies, so I can sell more puppies to make more money from, you know, some new dress, or I want a new house. You go and get a stud dog, you breed the female, you have the puppies, you sell the puppies.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's, a dog is a dog is a dog. And they're talking about Black people the same way as a dog.
Yes.
Okay? I can remember being taught when I was trying to understand the positioning of St. Catharines and Buffalo and Windsor and Detroit. Those two areas of access to Upper Canada. Trying to figure it out about calling a woman a dog. And I'm not using the B word here. And that analogy that we used back then to try and understand what went on. And for all the different people that came across, some had fairly good experience, others didn't, others had horrendous experiences. But how kind can a master be if they're your master? You must depend on them for your food, your clothing. You cannot marry. Your husband is a husband without a bed, a man without a bed. The master could come in and take your woman anytime he wanted to, or breed her to someone else. They had to justify that. You see what's going on in the United States right now? Anybody in their right mind can listen to this and know it's a lie. They use their eyes. They know it, know what's going on. But there's still people out there that swear that this is true.
Yep.
It's no different. Absolutely no different. See, people today, when you talk about slavery, they still think with the mind in the 21st century. You got to put your mind back to understand. We had no rights, period.
Mhm.
So you made that animal behave.
Thank you for answering so fully. I really appreciate that.
I hope it helps.
Yes, it does.
Is there any other questions? Okay. Well, on behalf of myself, oh, sorry. Taylor,
Oh,
did you have a
sorry,
question?
The transition between what happens here and the same thing out in Nova Scotia, when all the Black people were refused to be able to live there, moving away to New Orleans and create another grand. Well, now you see in Mississippi, the beautiful Black people down there, they all get along quite well. And that kind of history disappeared too in Nova Scotia.
Oh, true. That's
Yeah.
true. And again, I was saying to Meredith before we started, trying to reclaim our history. I'm truly blessed that I've been able to locate, and not alone. And I thank God for people like Peter Myler and Hilary Dawson and Carolyn Smart-Spross and Wilma Morrison and all of those that have helped me along the way. May God bless them, because to want to know who you were, to help a person be comfortable in their own skin, and to have those hands helping you, that means more to me. And that's why I try to do what I do to help others understand. And so for everyone we find out of those 30 or 40,000, if we find a story, that is a gift. But at the same time, I don't believe that we are given this, beautiful history with all the, the harsh parts of it. It's still our history. It's not just a void. When something like this, we have something to fill that void, where most whites can say, trace their ancestors back to early Britain, medieval times. We can't do that. There's a gap between our history and Mother Africa. And the other thing that I try to get across to young Black people is it doesn't matter if you're Canadian Black, if you're West Indian, if you're American, if you're from Mother Africa, if you're from whatever tribe in Mother, we're all from Mother Africa. And so I don't get this. I guess because I'm mixed blood, that I didn't fit in anywhere. And as a kid, I just wanted to be comfortable in my own skin. And I was a grown woman, you know, approaching middle age by the time I could be comfortable in my own skin. And now I am, this is who I am and what I am. Take me or leave me. And I think that's it's something I wish for everyone to feel, that fulfillment. You know, and yet you have people that say, well, they're all dead, so what does it matter? But we stand on their shoulders. Their genes run through our bodies. We can, you know, people will say, I don't understand where lupus come from, or I don't understand why I have diabetes, or I don't know why this is happening, or where I got artistic talent, or whatever the case may be. It comes right down the gene pool. But see, I want to know where I got these traits. Who made me who I am? And I know I'm not the only one out there. We didn't just get found under a cabbage leaf or dropped, you know, from a cloud and land somewhere. We have history. And our children need to be proud of that history. And our white brothers and sisters need to understand that we're not always combative. We just want to be accepted on equal terms for who we are. That we can cherish your traits, your culture, as well as our own, and share with you. Because there's always something to be learned. No matter how educated you are or how intelligent you are, because it's not always the same thing, there's always something to be learned, and then apply it. You know,
I wish her good luck in future homework, because she's got a lot to do yet. So,
well, if it's my journey, it will be given to me. If it's not, it'll be given to another person to carry on. That's just how it works.
yeah.
But thank you for your questions.
It took a long time for the black children to go to the white school. There was lots of fights going on. I remember that.
Oh yeah, even in my generation.
Yeah.
If you find any of us old people out there that went to school, or any of those old people that went to school with me, ask them how I had to fight my way to and from school. These things happen. And I didn't think anything of it back then.
And it's still happening today.
I would rather fight my way home than to meet my mother at the door because I was late to do my chores. And I was always taught to stand up for my rights. And my father always said to me, don't start it, but finish it, which I always did. But school, it was denied, because with education, if you can keep someone ignorant, this, you know the old saying, when a kid tells a lie, they get caught with their hand in the cookie jar. And the kid keeps telling lies and lies. And meanwhile, the hand is in the cookie jar. You can see it. And they're not letting go of that cookie, but they're going to lie with every excuse in the world and blame everybody else, find excuses why their hand's in that cookie jar, and without taking responsibility. We didn't ask to come here. We were torn from our families from Mother Africa and brought here. Not that we wanted to come. We didn't have a choice. So that's the difference. And it was different than indenturehood. England, you could indenture yourself to come and serve for 7 years. Then you were free to do what you wanted. We didn't have that choice. That's a difference. People say, Well, there's laws that, you know, prevent this. You know, making a law and exercising a law is two different things. Or seeking help from the law is two different things. Law and justice, sometimes they just don't fit. Like going to vote. In the United States, when they finally gave the black man the vote, that was fine. We give him the vote, but he had to get there in one piece to put the ballot in the box. If he was lynched on the way or shot, oh well. If you look at the background of slavery in the United States, you'll see all of this by state, whatever the needs of that state was. And here in Canada, it was tucked away because the propaganda with the War of 1812 between Britain and the United States, it all had to be on the United States. It was right here too. That's how the term the reverse Underground Railroad came into being, because they were running from here where they were enslaved over to the United States where they were free in the northern states. And then when things started over there again, they came back over here where they were free. It was survive. I don't know if that helped.
Yeah, it's definitely there is a lot, and
It's
it's
a different
obviously
perspective.
yeah,
A different
yeah,
perspective.
yeah. And honestly, as I was going to say, on behalf of myself and the Simcoe County Museum, Janie, I want to thank you. You shared a very important story today, and I'm glad we were able to hear about it, because it is important to hear these stories. And then, yeah, just all the other, it's very important to share these Black history stories. I think it's important to share them all year round, but I'm glad that we're able to focus on them in the month of February. I think it's really important. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
We had another comment saying thank you again. Once again, it was a very powerful story. And I appreciate it, and I'm sure all the other people that joined us today appreciated it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and we just have people saying, Olivia White said, thank you for your time today, Janie. And then Taylor Ross said, on behalf of the residents at Simcoe Manor, thank you. And then Karen Upshaw said, thanks. Thank you so much. Yeah, as I said, it was very powerful. So thank you very much.
Happy Black History Month.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We will have another presentation next week, so feel free to join us then as well. Thank you. Have a nice day, everyone.